Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where these videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. If you've not already done so, please silence your phones. This Sunday, August the 4th at 2 p.m., we'll have the August edition of our summer music series featuring Malia Dawn, an R&B artist and songwriter based in Jackson. Join us for that. And then come back the following Sunday, August 11th, when at 2 p.m. we'll show the documentary An Ordinary Hero, the true story of Joan Trumpauer Mulholland. And Joan Trumpauer Mulholland and her son, the filmmaker Loki Mulholland, will be here for a post-screening conversation. So come back for that. And finally, I hope that we'll see you next week for History's Lunch, when we'll have our own Bob Dent and Carolyn Gray Primer presenting MDAH and the Mississippi Burning case files. Today, we are delighted to have Stephen Parks and Noah Saterstrom to present What Became of Dr. Smith, A Life Rediscovered. Stephen Parks is the State Librarian of Mississippi and oversees the State Law Library. He earned his JD at Mississippi College School of Law and his MLIS at the University of Southern Mississippi. As an adjunct with the University of Southern Mississippi's Library and Information Science Department, Parks teaches courses on locating government resources and publications. Nashville resident Noah Saterstrom was raised in Mississippi and educated at Scotland's Glasgow School of Art. He's held residencies at His Royal Highness Prince Charles's Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, Scotland, Morris and Spottiswoode in Glasgow, Scotland, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts in Amherst, Virginia, and Exploded View Microcinema in Tucson, Arizona. Saterstrom's work, Road to Shibuda, was included in the Mississippi Museum of Art's 2018 exhibition Picturing Mississippi and later acquired by the museum, which currently features Saterstrom exhibition What Became of Dr. Smith. And following today's talk, we'll wrap up pretty quickly with book sales, so if you want one, hop up there soon at the end. Noah will be giving a gallery talk at the Art Museum at 1:30, so make plans to head down to that if you're able to. Help me bring to the stage Stephen Parks and Noah Saterstrom.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This will be a little bit of a conversation between Noah and myself, where we talk about his painting style, the exhibit itself, and also some of the research we did that created this project for him. But before we get into the actual exhibit and how we researched, Noah, how about tell the people here a little bit about your background coming from Natchez area and what led you to want to research Dr. Smith, who is would have been your great-grandfather.
First of all, thank you all for coming. It's a really great crowd. It's a subject that is very close to me, and it's also ties more broadly into general inquisitiveness, curiosity, and I know that that is a much bigger subject that is appealing to a lot of people, and a lot of people that come to this talk series, especially. Curiosity. And History is Lunch makes no sense, and I love that. Every time I say it, I'm like, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, and I love that. So I'm from Natchez, Mississippi, and I'm going to make this very, very brief because I could go on, but there are a lot of different ways you can learn about this story. Mainly going over to the museum, and I'm going to be talking more about it in the book. The museum did a fantastic job encapsulating a very big story, much better than I do. I'm from Natchez, Mississippi. I come from, on my mother's side, a very well-documented, old, aristocratic, white, powerful Mississippi family. Brandon, Mississippi is named after them, the Brandons. And they documented themselves very thoroughly and appreciated themselves immensely and held themselves in very high regard. And so you could, I learned, as we all did through my grandmother, the patriarchal lineage going back to the immigrant ancestor, Gerard Brandon I, who bought his land from the Spanish outside of Natchez in the 1780s, something like that. And I had been for years working on family stories, using it as subject matter for paintings. Some very troubling stories related to my family's involvement in slavery, and digging through archives, digging through letters, diaries, public record. This was in years past. That led up to me making the Road to Shibuda painting, among others, that was specifically about my family's relationship to slavery, and based on my great-great-grandfather's memoirs written in the 1920s. And I came down to give a talk at the museum around the Road to Shibuda and that whole beautiful Picturing Mississippi exhibition, and there was a lovely conversation about history and memory and complicated stories and the role of painting and role of art. And it was on that trip that I decided to look into the one family member that no one ever talked about and was a gaping absence in this very thorough documentation of the family. There was one person that was just like a black hole. I had been interested in his absence since I first learned about him as a child, got very interested. This is my grandmother's father. And I will make this very brief, but I remember in high school sitting with my grandmother and asking her, we're looking through photographs from one of these albums that we're going to be showing some photographs. And we got to a photograph of her at 3 sitting on the hood of a Model T Ford, and there was a man's hand reaching out to steady her, and I could see he had a wedding ring on. I was like, is that your father's hand? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, what can you tell me about him? And she said, he was an optometrist. And then she just froze. She couldn't get through any more information than that. And she was 90-ish at this point. And she had a little photograph of him on her desk. And he had disappeared when she was 7. And that pain of his absence had remained undiluted, at least so it seemed, her entire life, her long life. She died at 97, I think, and was never able to speak about him. After he died, this Road to Shibuda, that whole show, I came to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History and said, I've got to figure out what happened to my great-grandfather. I know that he disappeared in 1925, and I know that he died at Whitfield. That is basically all I know. And they brought out the old ledger from the old asylum, and I sat there until I found his name. And it had only that he was from Claiborne County and the date he was admitted. There was no diagnosis, no release date, no anything, no next of kin. I went from there, talked to Betsy Bradley. We shared our interest in all of this story. And then I went over to Fisher Galleries and just happened to meet Stephen Parks, who was there. And I told him about the story, and he said, well, I'm a state librarian. Let me look him up. And then a couple of weeks later, Stephen starts texting me. And this story that had been just like, I'm not trying to make it a magical thing, but it's like it was a seed that was just sitting there for a century. And, we started watering it and sunshine, and all of a sudden it just starts coming to life. So,
and we'll get to the gardening of it to make it grow. But let's go through some of these pictures first. Who would this be?
This is my great-grandmother, Ethel, who is married to Dr. Smith.
And you took, over the past few years, you've started painting these old family photos.
Yeah, so Stephen and I started accumulating. Stephen would gather information that he would find, and we'll talk more about this, but we spent 3 years just gathering information and just cataloging it, making a chronology of his life, trying to piece together the puzzle. And then the pandemic hit, and I stopped everything else I was doing, and at that point had a massive amount of imagery that I wanted to paint. And so when the pandemic hit, that's all I started doing was these little tiny 12-inch square oil paintings of every photograph, every story, every scene from a newspaper clipping that I could find, and I spent the next 2 years painting some like 1,500 of them. And so they were all like this. So a lot of them are really direct from photographs, and some, as you'll see, starts to become more kind of allegorical, metaphorical.
Just going to scroll through these quickly, and then we'll get
Yeah.
to the real story of finding all this information. If you are on social media, Noah has a great Instagram page where he posts a lot of these paintings. And this is a home in Natchez, I believe.
Yep, the Brandon House. Still there on North Union Street.
And there's a picture not in our slides, but you mentioned Dr. Smith's hand being in one picture. You also sent me a picture one day of a shadow of a man
Yeah.
in the picture, taking a picture of a little girl, and we assumed that may
Yeah.
have been Dr. Smith taking the picture, or at least his shadow being in that picture as well. But other than the small portrait that your grandmother had on her table, was that the only picture of him that you knew of?
That was the only picture that I knew of. Yeah. And I mean, to this day, there aren't that many, but you were able to find some, well, we'll get to that.
Let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and move into them to Dr. David L.
Yeah,
Smith.
one quick note, this collaboration has been really interesting for me. Archivists and research people, people who are accustomed to like going out to find information. It's so much about, like we both start from curiosity, inquisitiveness. We're just kind of looking. But then once Stephen starts finding things, it's very hard and factual. And everything needs to be cross-referenced, everything needs to be verified, and it is all like, this actually happened, and we need to figure out what maybe didn't happen so we can weed out facts from non-facts or whatever. Whereas as a painter, it's a very different process. It starts with curiosity, at least in my experience, and then once it re-enters the studio, anything can happen from there, and anything kind of has to. That's just the painting process. It's a much more malleable, undefined kind of process. And so you'll see some images sort of start to veer toward allegory or towards metaphor or whatever other visual language just sort of naturally happens there. So it's just an interesting subcurrent that goes throughout.
Yeah. And as on the research angle, when he was telling me this story, I wanted to find an answer, because as a librarian, it's like putting a puzzle together. And if I couldn't find a piece, it kind of ruined my research day. But we kind of learned through this process, sometimes you are not going to know the entire answer. And that is true in this story. But we have found quite a few pieces, and this is I think from a pamphlet that Dr. Smith would pass out, or an advertisement pamphlet?
Yeah, and that's actually the photograph that grandmother had on her desk, the original photograph that is used in most of his advertisements in the 19-teens.
And he would travel across the state and even into Louisiana with a traveling optometrist shop. We found a notice that he had filed a patent to have that type of truck patented. That's one of the research dead ends I hit. I could not find where that patent application was anywhere, which may have meant that it was never approved. But we found pictures of the truck. We have never found the actual truck itself, but he would travel, and it would make advertisements across the newspapers of the state in Louisiana. Dr. Smith's coming to such and such town. He'll be here these certain dates. If your kids are going to school this fall, come get their eyes checked. So he was a traveling optometrist that the state went after. They had just passed a optometry law in 1920, I believe, and tried to put a stop to these traveling, or they called them itinerant optometrists. And another dead end I hit was he supposedly filed a suit against the state to say that was an unconstitutional challenge to his right to work. And I could never find that case, which was one of my dead ends that I hit. The eye comes across in your art quite often, even before Dr. Smith, or do you think it came from?
It actually came before that, but one of the things that, as a painter, if you've got a Mississippi optometrist who's suffering from schizophrenia, there's already so much visual vocabulary there to work with. and so it was my job then to like herd all of the imagery related to all of this in a direction that I could then use as, raw material. I want to give like a very brief account of of the trajectory, because this is chronological, right? If we could just get a very brief.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go towards that. Okay, so I meet Noah. He gives me the name of David Smith, approximate date range. And this is a plug for your libraries and archives. Oftentimes they will have subscriptions to newspapers.com, especially MDAH has it in their library. If you don't have your own personal account, go over to archives and you can search newspapers.com. And that's really what I did to get started, having my own personal account. And these were two of the first things that popped up. If you want to give a little
So I began this search. Basically, the point of entry for me was when he actually disappeared. And so we knew that he disappeared in 1925. So Stephen started looking right around in that area, and he found one of the first things he found was Dr. Smith, an optometrist, was admitted to the old asylum.
Yes.
Because of a serious assault charge from last September. And so we're like, wait, serious assault charge. So he goes back to last September and finds that he was testing eyes in Port Gibson. A 15-year-old girl came to get her eyes tested, and she left accusing him of assaulting her. And it was unclear what happened, and it remains unclear. He was set upon by an angry mob of her relatives who were in the process of lynching him when the sheriff came of Claiborne County and arrested him, put him in jail, where he stayed for 5 months, and then was not given a criminal trial. He was given a lunacy trial, committed to the old asylum. So that's the bare bones of it.
Right.
But it gets a lot more kind of intricate.
We found a lot in newspapers.com. We found some in the microfilm reels over here at MDAH. The Port Gibson paper is not on newspapers.com, but they do have a reel of it here at the Department of Archives. So we started finding these. We started noticing also you have to play around with your search terms. Sometimes he's referred to as D.L. Smith. Sometimes it's David Lawson Smith. Even found him referred to as L.D. Smith at times. So you have to, if you're doing your research, you have to be willing to change your search terms to try to open up the web you're casting to find answers. So we find out there was a criminal charge. Well, the law librarian in me says, well, if there's a criminal charge, maybe there's some court documents somewhere. So I drive down to Port Gibson Courthouse, Claiborne County one day. I start asking questions. I will give a suggestion if you start going down this path. Have as much information as you can before you approach a clerk of court. The more information you can give them, I think it tells them you're serious about doing your research. And with the last name Smith, if I had just shown up, hey, I'm looking for
David Smith.
They might have said, oh, that might be too long of a process. Can you come back? But I had as much information as I could have. Found the docket. This is for the criminal aspect of the case before we even get into the asylum. And it was Dr. State versus Dr. Smith, D.L. Smith. But as we found, that criminal aspect eventually turned over into what was called a lunacy hearing. And this is where Dr. Smith's mother enters the picture. Do we know if she was around that area at that time, or she just...
She's a very slippery character. She would have been, yes.
Okay.
And she was influential in getting him a lunacy trial instead of a criminal trial.
Do you feel like the Brandon side of the family, and I'm just speculating here because you mentioned how rich and would they have wanted to have him thrown away so the criminal aspect wouldn't be what was known about him?
I mean, it's hard to know what the Brandon side of the family approached all of this very tricky situation with their main tool, which was silence and avoidance, basically. And I'm not saying that there was a better way for them to do it, but instead of having a criminal trial, they made sure that he got a lunacy trial, removed him from the picture, and he was erased from the family. It was very quick, and it was very efficient, and there was very little that made it beyond the courtroom.
And we really lucked out with this being in the Claiborne County Courthouse. A lot of courthouses in our state have either burned or had water damage over the years. So just because we were able to find this doesn't mean you're going to be able to find every record in this state. I don't have it in the slides here, but this also took me down to Louisiana to do some research on David's father, who also was in the Louisiana asylum. Hinds County Courthouse had some records of this. When Dr. Smith was committed to the asylum, that's a grounds for a divorce here in Mississippi. And his wife did divorce him eventually, and that record is in the Hinds County Courthouse. So he is eventually put into the asylum. So you started painting what you envisioned of what the asylum could have appeared. Because at this point, you did not have any medical records or asylum records of what might have taken place.
Yeah, I mean, once at the point where we had just started to piece together the bones of his life, is when I met Lyda Gibson and Dr. Didlake and the wonderful Asylum Hill people, who a lot of whom are here today, the archaeologists from that amazing project. And so I was in touch with Lyda a lot about what the old asylum would have looked like, what it would have been like, and then Stephen found some of the records from the old asylum, the state reports. And so I'd research a lot of that and start to kind of piece together things that were not necessarily Dr. Smith related, but were adjacent to his story, so that I could, paint it, complete the narrative.
I think when people think of asylums today, they think of what you see in the movies. It might be scary or torture of some degree. But if you go back to when our asylums were created in the 19th century, it was a big movement to have these asylums created. Dorothea Dix from North Carolina would come down to give suggestions to the state about how to handle mental health in the asylum. So it was a big movement to have these asylums created. I'm sure the people's opinions would be different now based on funding that goes to asylums, or hospitals as we call them now. But you did start painting what you would envision, nurses taking care of the patients, different types of treatment that we did come across, not necessarily for Dr. Smith, but treatments that were mentioned in those reports, such as water treatment.
Hydrotherapy, a lot of hydrotherapy. I mean, the difference between the old asylum and Whitfield was really dramatic, but it caused me to have to learn a lot about the history of the asylum, the history of optometry, the history of mental health care in Mississippi.
So this is kind of stepping back, but Noah did mention that after the accusation against Dr. Smith about the assault, and I will say we don't know that was guilty of that. There was never a conviction. This is all just speculation based on what was reported in the newspapers, and we don't have any in-person accounts. So the crowd thought he was obviously guilty, and a mob did form, and newspapers did describe it as a potential lynching that was going to take place. But the sheriff of Port Gibson did put a stop to it and had David thrown in jail to protect him. And these are some of the records from that. This made newspapers up in Tennessee, in Louisiana. So it did kind of spread. I mentioned you have to be careful with your research terms. That one on the right calls him Z.L. Smith. His age has been different.
His age, yeah.
In all the accounts.
And the way that they phrase the accusations against him are different in every article, and the details are different in every article. And some of them seem to be pretty clear that they're basing their language on rumor that they're hearing on the streets of Vicksburg. So it's very difficult to try to parse out what is what you can lean on as truth. Some very strange tales started to come out, which I guess we'll get to. That when he was...
So these are just a few paintings of the mob. And I believe there's a painting of this in the actual exhibit.
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, there it is in the show itself.
But then he's put in jail, and then this was also a good find. I started texting Noah about, I can't believe I found this.
This would be the first really good find
Yeah,
at the Claiborne County Courthouse.
So then the Claiborne County court file, they had letters he had written from jail. Letters he wrote to the governor, to the Secret Service, and I'll let Noah talk about the Secret Service angle. Letters to his father, who we assumed was deceased.
And that gets really weird, yeah.
We'll do that in a little bit.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other story. But talk about these letters.
So these letters, this, remembering this was 100 years after he had disappeared, and there had been basically not a peep from the man for a century. And then to suddenly have letters written in his hand while he was in jail in the midst of a state of psychosis, and being able to see his handwriting and hear his language and get a glimpse into his state of mind, it was just absolutely phenomenal revelation to me that this kind of thing could exist out there in the public. It was just in a closet, right? It was just in a closet at the courthouse where he was detained. He wrote to the governor, Governor Whitfield, at that time, asking for protection for him and his family from people who were trying to persecute him. He believed himself to be working as a breeder for the Secret Service. Still unclear what that means, but it had some sort of eugenics-y type undertone to it. He wrote to his father, who may or may not have been alive at that point, which we'll maybe have time to get to, and described. He structured that letter according to the six senses, including the sixth sense of psychic impression. And so there was this whole fantastical world that he was living in while being confined to jail during those months in Port Gibson.
And these, as you can see, they were in pretty much pristine condition. We really were lucky to find these. And I believe the courthouse allowed some of these to be on exhibit in the exhibit.
Yeah, they're there at the museum right now, yeah.
These are just a few other ones. The middle one there is the envelope to the Governor Whitfield.
That's the one to his father.
On the right to his father. So he's in jail during this whole time, writing these letters while the lunacy hearing is starting to take place. And then this is where it shows up in the paintings of Dr. Smith being in the jail, writing these letters. And this kind of jumps a little forward.
But this was actually a pretty early find. Not long after he found the whole beginning part of the story, he suddenly found in 1950 in the Clarion Ledger a large photograph of Dr. Smith, visored with a beard, sitting there at the loom at Whitfield in their occupational therapy program. So this would have been 25 years after he was admitted, when he had ceased to exist in the world as far as the family was concerned. And there he is in the Jackson newspaper as an older man, still referred to as Dr. D.L. Smith, which we find interesting. One of the outstanding questions is, was he operating as an optometrist at the asylum and at Whitfield? And we actually very recently, just like right before the opening of the show, Stephen found an article that implied that he was acting as an optometrist at the old asylum after he was admitted.
So this article, not long after he was taken to Jackson, where the asylum would have been at the time, and put in there, he was given permission to leave, to go to Vicksburg and visit family. And he makes it to Vicksburg and decides he wants to just continue leaving and heading out west. And this article mentions about how, you got to come back to the asylum. But it does say he went willingly, so he didn't put up a fight.
Well, he telegrammed over to the superintendent of the asylum and said, letting you know, I'm getting on a train to go west. And they were like, no, you're not. And they showed up, and they heard this article. They referred to him as Dr. Smith in this really sarcastic way. And then throughout, it's a pretty cheeky article, and it is clearly drawing on the rumors on there at the platform at the Vicksburg train station. People recognized him from when he was a figure in town, looks basically the same, but a little bit thinner. And they talked about how he had escaped state custody the night before they were taking him to the asylum, and this is true. And the article says he escaped from the Claiborne County Jail before they had a chance to take him to the asylum, and fled on foot, disappeared into the night, and then 3 weeks later showed up at the White House and sat down with President Coolidge and was telling him about how he was persecuted, and halfway through the conversation, the president realized that he was not of sound mind and called security over. And the Claiborne County Sheriff drove to Washington, D.C. personally to drive him back, which just seems like that can't possibly be true. But like 90% of it is. He didn't sit down with Coolidge, he sat down with the head of the Secret Service. Mm-hmm. And that is documented in his intake interview at the asylum, which Lyda Gibson recently found, his medical records. It's a whole other thing.
It's just a few other paintings. Before.
And so that's where, as an artist, I don't necessarily need to know if he sat down with the president. I need to know if it was written in the newspaper that he had sat down with the president, because that's an important aspect to me. If it needed to be 100% factual, like it would be for an archivist, then you got to parse it out. But the rumor on the street is relevant to me. As a painter, I find that part of the narrative. So you'll see in the painting at the museum, you'll see that story shows up there.
It's just a few other scenes from what we envision took place at the asylum. I've often wondered about this painting.
That's a hydrotherapy.
Okay.
The show at the museum, by the time that painting was finished, and I'll talk more in depth about that at the museum, the process, but in terms of our partnership in this, by the time I was finished with the painting, all the information we had found, which is a massive amount of information, basically stopped when he entered the asylum. And he lived for 40 years in state custody before he died in 1965, and there was nothing that I had to go by, almost nothing at all, until Lyda found or not Lyda, but the archivists at the Asylum Hill Project found his medical records, which I still haven't seen all of. And so you'll notice that in the painting, from the time he enters the asylum, it becomes, the tenor changes, because everything becomes less specific to Dr. Smith, because I only had what I could go on, even family rumors were sparse at that point.
Right. And we're still finding things. These are 3 instances or 4 instances of newspapers that have been added to newspapers.com and just in the past year from the Vicksburg paper.
The Natchez paper still isn't on there, right, for those years, 24
Right.
and 25, the Natchez Democrat.
This gave us a few more information. One describes him as a talker. I think it was, the man is a good talker. And so there's still things coming out. Noah is hopefully getting the medical records one day. There's other aspects. When I was compiling information, there was a lot of lanes I could have gone down, but as a researcher, you do need to know when to stop. Before we get to questions, just a few stories of detours we could have taken, which probably would have gone down the rabbit hole. And we mentioned Dr. Smith's father. I was speaking at LSU Law Library back in 2019 and decided to go over to, I think it was Feliciana Parish, I believe, to the courthouse, because I had seen records in newspapers where after David's father supposedly had passed away, his mother remarries. And she gets engaged, and she becomes the first woman in Louisiana to lose a lawsuit for a promise to marry. She promised this man she was going to marry him. She didn't. He had given her all her money, his money, and then he filed suit, and she lost in the lawsuit. So I go to that courthouse and find the court file there. This is even earlier than 1924. This is like 1903 or 4 or 5.
yeah.
And in that record, they had a record where Dr. Smith's father had been committed to the Louisiana asylum, and also had letters implying that he perhaps was not dead at the time, where we thought he had passed away at the asylum. We even found a death record from the asylum.
Yeah, so he's looking at this breach of promise file at the Donaldsonville courthouse. And in it, he finds a letter written from Dr. Smith's mother to her brother-in-law. This gets very squirrely, but I'll make it brief. Dr. Smith's father entered the Louisiana State Asylum in 1898 and died there a month later. And they received a medical death certificate, and he found that in the file. And then he also found in the file a letter that was written from Dr. Smith's father in 1904 to his brother-in-law saying, Minnie, Dr. Smith's mother, I hear that Minnie is going to be remarried. She thinks that I'm dead. You need to stop this from happening. And he had escaped from the asylum and sent a coffin of God knows what to his wife, and with the note saying, your husband has died of yellow fever, so you can't open the coffin. So they just buried it, presumably in Donaldsonville. We still don't know what's in there, and I would still like to exhume it, frankly. But his father was then just on the lam, and so she couldn't remarry because she was still married. And so it gets very,
Yeah, and we tried to trace her down after the 1924-25 era. She kind of disappears.
It's hard to know when to stop.
Yeah.
Because some of these, if we had stopped before then, there are some rabbit holes that we wouldn't have gotten to go down.
Yeah.
But there is a certain point where it's like, if we just keep digging,
Another thing I tried to find was, I found out there's an optometry museum up in St. Louis, and supposedly they have records of the Mississippi Optometrist Association, where Dr. Smith was a vice president. So he was known throughout the state for his practice. Well, then the pandemic hit, that museum closes and eventually reopens. But once I finally connected back with them a couple of years later, they looked in the Mississippi records, and there was nothing really that would have provided us any information. Another thing we've not answered, and which we may never be able to, is where exactly is David buried? For years, early on in the process, we went by findagraves.com. It mentioned a David Lawson Smith with his birth date, with his death date, supposedly buried in Natchez.
next to someone called Minnie.
Next to Minnie, who we had never heard, a wife called Minnie. But we talked to Natchez.
Mimi Miller.
Mimi Miller, and she said, no, he could not be buried there. So that Find a Grave, I tried to get it corrected, but the creator never reached back out to me. But we eventually did find that we believe he is buried at Whitfield, but they have no record of where. There are so many buried out there where they only have a small stone to mark the grave, but there's no record of what name goes with what stone. So that may just be one unanswerable question that we will always have in this project.
And I mean, I guess with all, inquiries like this, there's a point at which you still have to just kind of concede to the mystery. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have more questions now than I started out with, for sure. Because I started out with, what happened to my great-grandfather? But now I've got way more specific questions than that.
And these only came up because every few weeks or every few months, if I have some downtime at work, I'll get on newspapers.com and start typing away. And I luckily came across these. So it's not a project that we are continuing to ongoing, research every day. But if something pops up and I found these, I shoot them to Noah, and it just gets
I
added
haven't
to the
given up
file.
on any aspect of it. I mean, at this point, it's just like unwrapping a mummy. It just goes on and on. I think we're good for...
We'll turn it over to questions, and Chris will have a microphone.
Speakers today, raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you.
Thanks. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation, discussion. I'm just wondering, during the time Dr. Smith's life as an optometrist, around that same time we have in Mississippi and elsewhere throughout the United States, segregation and separation and Jim Crow laws. And I'm wondering if Dr. Smith, because doctors could decide whether they're going to treat black patients or not. Or they have a special time and place to treat black people. And I'm wondering if Dr. Smith, while he was practicing, if he had any black patients, or if when he was in the asylum in his institution, were there any black nurses that were allowed to treat him or be associated with his treatment?
That's a very good question, and I can speak a little bit to that. Dr. Smith was, he considered himself to be a very modern, forward-thinking kind of doctor, and part of his, the big driving force between his itinerant business was this kind of socialist ideal that he should bring, and he writes extensively about this, bringing modern optometry that you would get in the cities to the people in the country. And he writes in his advertisements regularly that he treats white and black people in his business. And his objective was to go around the country into the poorer sections of the state, the rural sections of the state, and check eyes for free. And only if somebody needed glasses could he then make glasses for them. And so he was a proponent of that. I can't think of any specific instances of him talking about treating black patients, but there are definitely advertisements where he advertises to black patients. I know that when we were researching the old asylum and the way that the so-called black ward was in a very pathetic state, seems I remember windowless and an interior ward in the old asylum. Everything was decrepit by the time Dr. Smith entered, but the black ward was especially in disrepair.
And they would have segregated events. USM has a collection of state hospital newsletters, and they would talk about having the white dance one night and having the black dance another night. So the activities and the treatment was most likely
And
segregated.
access to the outside,
Yeah.
access to the lawn was restricted for black patients, if I understand it right. Whitfield had a different philosophy. I'm not a historian of any of this, but I know that the intention was for things to be a lot more egalitarian at Whitfield. I was talking to Dr. Reb McMichael at the beginning when we were trying to determine the degree to which we could trust any of the language around Dr. Smith's assault charges and all that. And he said, when like Whitfield, people could be accused of anything and sent to Whitfield to the asylum. I mean, it was like, you could be sent away. And so he could have been, he could have been an alcoholic, he could have been gay, he could have a black mistress, he could have all sorts of stuff that people would just decide, that he needed to be removed. But Dr. McMichael said, Whitfield, there are documented instances where Whitfield would, if there was a lynch mob after a black man, they could take in the black man, and I haven't seen the documents of it, so I don't have the details, but he said they would take the black individual and ship him out west, and Whitfield would be like a way station for safety to, you could get him into Whitfield, and then Whitfield would get him out, which was a very strange kind of role for a state hospital. It's very sad. But yeah, to your point, I know that he did treat black patients, but I have no documentation of it, no, other than his advertisements.
And there's been a book published this year, I can't remember the author, but it's called Madness, Asylums in the Jim Crow Era, that may be of interest.
You've inspired me to go back to looking at my roots. I thought I had
I don't know what you're gonna find.
a difficult name with Johnson, but if you found all this was Smith.
Yeah, you're good.
I'm impressed. Did you find any records of his education? Where did he go to school? How did he learn to be an ophthalmologist? Was that what it was?
Oh, I mean, every aspect of this you have to look at it from a lot of different angles. He claimed that he had gotten his degree, in his advertisements, he claimed that he had gotten a degree from the optometry school in New Orleans, a doctorate degree. First of all, the doctorate degree from the optometry school in New Orleans consisted of like 3 months of distance learning, basically, and then they give you, but he didn't even do that, as it turns out, which I learned only when his medical records from the old asylum came out just in the last couple of months. He trained with a cousin of his. I don't even know if I told you this. He was out in California and was an apprentice to a cousin of his who had an optometry shop in Oakland. And then he came and he was working on sugar factories. And he wound up being trained as an optometrist out there, and then came to New Orleans. In the New Orleans school, all they did was front him the equipment to start his own business. So it's a little bit like, early days of optometry, very mushy about what was expected, which was one of his big beefs, because he hated who he called spec peddlers, who were like untrained, selling crap glasses to poor people and, not having any real medical training. And so when he became president of the Optometry Association, he helped draft the anti-itinerant optometry legislation that then wound up shutting down his own business as soon as he started it, which triggered a kind of psychosis in him that began his decline.
And there was no state regulation for optometrists up until the
No,
1920s.
no.
So
And he helped to get an
he helped-
optometry board
yeah.
for certification.
yeah. We tried looking to see if there were any records of the New Orleans school, but that was another dead
It
end.
existed, but it had only been up and running like 6 months by the time he claimed to have gotten his degree there, so.
Did your research find any evidence of his mental illness prior to the criminal charges?
Jeez. That also gets very tricky, because in his letter to Governor Whitfield from jail, he refers to the governor to a time when he was found not of sound mind by a chancery court in Natchez in 1916, when they were living there, when they had first got married and he was living in Natchez. We can't find any reference to that. And this was before the lunacy trial. So he claims that he was already found not of sound mind before he even started his business. So I have no idea. He also claims that was when the persecution started and people were trying to embezzle from him. And
There was almost always a grain of truth to
Yeah.
some of his delusions, because one of his delusions was that land and money had been stolen from his family that belonged to him. And we didn't think much about it, but as we kept digging, there was a little bit of truth to that.
And he claimed that his father was still alive, and the newspapers was like, this is proof that he says his father's still alive, and he died in 1898, and it wasn't until later that we were like, wait a minute, his father might have been alive. Now we know he escaped from the Louisiana asylum. We don't know if he was dead or not. So it's like, I'm going like, maybe the Secret Service did have a breeder program. I don't know. The Secret Service. How would I know that? It's not like you can Google it, I'm still like not convinced, it's eugenics. Could have been a eugenicsy type program, but, you don't know when to stop that, what's true and what isn't. But he to your point, For the divorce to be finalized, Ethel, my great-grandmother, had to testify to, if I remember right, to the superintendent of the asylum in court, or he signed it.
And to a jury.
That Dr. Smith was out of, not of sound mind when they got married, which was a weird, twisted thing that she would have to do. And I don't know if any proof was given or what, but she had to claim that not only was he mentally ill now, but he was when we married, whether she knew it then or not.
And we know the superintendent had to come testify before the jury for the divorce, but we don't have any record of anything he said. Any other questions?
We actually have one, I know, from our live stream. I can't read it without my cheaters.
Oh, we got a call in.
Sarah Campbell says, your description of the remaining unanswered questions and ongoing nature of the research makes me ask if it was difficult to determine when your project was ready for exhibit and publication.
It wasn't, because we had on the schedule at the museum that it needed to be up by 2024. And so, yeah, I mean, when we go over, whoever goes over to the talk, I mean, that is a certain thing. We've got to just call it at some point, not finished, but ready to be exhibited. As far as I'm concerned, there's no point in ever considering finishing any aspect of this. I mean, I don't know why.
But the
it would
beauty
be
of
an
your
artificial.
the beauty of your exhibit also, if something changes and something new comes up, you could take out a piece of it
Yeah.
and update it.
I mean, that's part of the structure of it is to allow there to be flexibility. And I mean, Lyda and I were joking all along, what if right before the show, the medical records emerge and it completely changes the amount of information. Right before the show opened, she was like, we found his medical records, like 280 pages worth of medical records spanning 40 years. Well, that doubles the amount of information I had. And so, you know, you just have to kind of show what's there and get a conversation going. You know, it's a good question, though.
Was there a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia?
Yep.
I mean, it's written down that
Yeah.
that was, okay.
Yeah. Yep. And his medical records seem to verify that, you know. He denied the assault charge for the entire 40 years he was in, and he remained, with his delusions continued. And according to the doctors, he had pleasant spirits, was congenial, got along with everybody, and would not be able to exist on the outside.
What about his father? Why was he put in the asylum?
We don't know. His father was, they claimed that he entered because of mental aberrations. This was the 1890s. He was having violent outbursts. According to his mother in the intake interview of Dr. Smith, Dr. Smith's mother was describing different things that had happened to him as a child, and one of them was being thrown against the wall by his father, who was having a fit at the time. And he claimed to have, the death certificate claimed that he had died of like manic exhaustion or some
Right.
archaic, but then they said he died of yellow fever, and apparently he didn't die at all. I mean, I assume eventually he did, but.
It's been a fascinating story, and I'm working here in Jackson, he's up in Nashville. We probably haven't physically seen each other more than 10 times. But it just worked out. We connected. The pandemic kind of slowed things down, and then, like you said, having a deadline was really helpful to get it done.
But none of this would have happened without Stephen. I mean, this is a century-long silence that Stephen helped to crack open. And then it was just a constant back and forth between his access to public records, which are pretty much most everybody's access to those records. It's just you knew how to
Correct, yes.
access them. And then I would have access to as many private records as we could, and then it was just a kind of back and forth. But indulging a curiosity to that degree is highly recommended. If you have a mystery in your family, go for it. You don't know, like, you don't know what's out there.
Speaking of family, and probably to close us out, how has your family responded to all of this?
Mostly positively.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, mostly positively. Opening up a question like this and displaying it publicly is maybe not universally supported, but the majority of the family members support it, and I feel like if I were to not follow this curiosity, I would be only avoiding it to protect the trauma that my ancestors had felt, and just absorbing it for my own self and keeping it intact for future generations. And so it felt to me almost like, I don't have any need to expose anybody's personal stories to the public, but it felt more like, to me, his story wanted to be told, and as soon as I committed to telling it, it came out. It was drawn out, and it continues to be drawn out. And so to cap it, would have felt so deeply wrong. To go, I'm going to tell this story, but then to go, well, I'm not going to tell all of it, would have been unethical, I feel like. So.
And hopefully this story will lead to other stories coming out of the Asylum Hill Project, as they're finding more and more remains and figuring out what to do with those, and hopefully connecting those with living descendants. So hopefully this story will be a springboard for more stories.
We've seen some of the individual paintings, but for the folks who haven't been there yet, will you talk a little bit about the structure? It's 122 feet long, all told.
Yeah, so after I'd done the about over 1,000 of those little studies, every image that I could think of to paint, I felt equipped to start working, on something. And so it was a massive information. And I started the big painting with his episode of psychosis when he disappeared. And the form it takes is, as you can see up there are 3 canvases tall. There are 24-inch canvases, so it's 6 feet tall. And then I started adding canvases and go, well, what happened before this? And then what happened just after this? And then it naturally went this way. It went to his birth, and that way it went to his grave. And so the whole thing is basically, it's completely chronological and as factually grounded as possible. And I based it visually, aesthetically, I based it on 14th century Sienese chapel paintings, narrative paintings from Siena, Italy. They'd have very similar forms. And so that structure allowed for a lot of flexibility. If we suddenly learned some new aspect, I could just take canvases out, spread out, do a whole new section. It allowed for a lot of flexibility. And so that's what the piece is. And then the museum did a beautiful job of elaborating the narrative. And so by the time you get to the painting, there's a lot of information you will have already seen and absorbed. And so then there's a beautiful interactive iPad situation in there that, it's just really well done. Yeah, come if you can, 1:30, 30 minutes.
One last question. Road to Shibuya is a large painting. This is monumental. Do you think you'll do anything like this again? Do you think there's another subject?
If I need to.
Yeah.
I didn't
It's
intend to
Natchez.
do this, so, how can I say? But it was fun. In a way, my wife would be like, but it seemed to just paint itself. Obviously it took up years and years and years, but it never felt like, what am I going to do here? It did seem to just want to be painted. So if that happens again, I guess I'll do it. But
Thank you all for being with us today. We have copies of the catalog, What Became of Dr. Smith, and it is fantastic. It's beautiful. You can come get a copy of that. I'm sure Noah will be happy to sign a copy for you. Don't forget about our summer music series that takes place at 2 o'clock this Sunday. And then next Wednesday, come back for History's Lunch when we'll have 2 MDH staffers who are going to talk about the Department of Archives and History and fairly recent records that have been released to the department from the Mississippi burning case. So it's really interesting there. One last time, help me thank Stephen Parks, Noah Saterstrom for a fantastic program.
Thanks for everything.